In 2006, a landmark case came to a close in the United States. United States versus Philip Morris. Federal Judge Gladys Kessler reviewed mountains of documents and delivered a verdict that shook the entire industry. She ruled that the country's largest tobacco companies had deliberately misled the public for decades. They knew the truth and said nothing. Then years later, in 2017, a court forced them to do the one thing they feared most. These giants were required to fund advertisements in which they confessed against themselves. In black and white, those ads stated that for years they had intentionally engineered cigarettes to make it harder for people to quit. And they didn't make that admission because their conscience suddenly woke up. They made it because they got caught. But that's the end of the story. Now let's go back to the beginning, thousands of years back. Because the most astonishing thing isn't how tobacco deceived the modern world. The most astonishing thing is that this plant was shaping human lives long before anyone seriously asked a simple question: could it actually be dangerous? Tobacco's homeland is the Americas. Plants of the genus Nicotiana grew there when the Old World hadn't yet heard a whisper of this continent, and the indigenous peoples had known them for a very, very long time. Scientists have found traces of this plant in ancient pipes that lay buried in the earth for centuries. And in 2012, chemists analyzed an ancient Maya vessel found in Mexico. The vessel was around 1,300 years old, made in approximately 700 CE. What made it remarkable was this: traces of tobacco compounds had survived inside it, and on the outer wall was an inscription that researchers read as House of Tobacco. In other words, people were labeling their tobacco storage containers 13 centuries ago. But for the indigenous peoples of the Americas, this was nothing like the smoking we know today. For them, tobacco was a sacred plant and a medicine. In the north of the continent, the tradition of the sacred pipe took root, and tobacco itself was offered as a gift, a gesture of respect, peace, and goodwill. Healers used it in ceremonies of healing. It wasn't a harmful habit. It was part of the spiritual life of entire peoples, passed down from generation to generation. And here's something especially important. Tobacco wasn't simply gathered from the wild. It was domesticated. The species that would eventually conquer the world emerged as a hybrid of different wild plants in South America. For centuries, people selected the finest specimens, crossbred them, and developed new varieties. Tobacco became one of the very first plants that humans on this continent domesticated with their own hands, long before anyone else in the world knew it existed. Great civilizations elevated this practice to a fine art. The Aztecs had a dedicated word for the plant. Their priests carried dried gourds filled with tobacco, and no important ceremony was complete without it. In the 16th century, the Spanish friar Bernardino de Sahagún documented everything he witnessed in an enormous work that would later be known as the Florentine Codex. Thanks to him, we still know today exactly how the people of that distant era regarded this remarkable plant. Tobacco traveled across the continent as a valuable trade good and a tool of diplomacy. There was, for instance, a people living in what is now Canada who were renowned throughout the region precisely as masters of growing and trading tobacco. Neighboring nations traveled to them for the plant, the way we travel to the best market in town. And then came 1492, the year that changed everything. When ships from Europe reached the shores of a land unknown to them, the local Taino people, in a spirit of generosity, offered the strangers their tobacco, as they always had, as a gesture of welcome. A friar named Ramon Pane became the first European to record this custom, which struck him as deeply strange. And that was it. The genie was out of the bottle. Spanish and Portuguese sailors acquired the habit, carried it aboard their ships, and spread it to every corner of the earth with truly astonishing speed. In Europe, the plant was received as a genuine wonder. it was declared a remedy for almost every ailment imaginable. A physician from the Spanish city of Seville, named Nicolas Monardes, wrote an entire treatise in 1571 attributing dozens of healing properties to tobacco, claiming it could treat wounds, pain, and practically any illness. And when Queen Catherine de' Medici of France began using it to treat her headaches, tobacco was promptly nicknamed the Queen's Herb. It sounds like the finest advertisement anyone could devise. And it worked without fail. Then something remarkable happened. The plant spread so rapidly that rulers across the world grew genuinely alarmed and began banning it, each trying to outdo the last in severity. In the powerful Ottoman Empire, authorities introduced a strict ban on smoking around 1633. In Ming Dynasty China, the emperor banned tobacco in 1639. In Russia, the plant remained prohibited until Tsar Peter I lifted the ban in 1697. Even the head of the Catholic Church, Pope Urban VIII, threatened the harshest ecclesiastical penalties in 1642 for anyone who dared to take snuff inside a church. And do you know what all these bans had in common? Not one of them worked, not a single one. Kings, sultans, emperors, the church itself, all of them proved powerless against a small plant with green leaves. No matter how mighty the person on the throne, they could not stop tobacco, especially once serious money entered the picture. How this humble plant became one of the most profitable machines in human history, and the terrible price that millions of ordinary people paid for it, we'll explore in Part 2. When the English colonies in America were just finding their footing, they desperately needed something they could make money from, and the answer was tobacco. In the lands then called the Chesapeake, present-day Virginia and Maryland, tobacco became the backbone of the entire economy. Without it, the colonies might simply not have survived. And this is where things become difficult to believe by today's standards. From 1618 onward, the colonies operated a clever system. Anyone who paid for a new settler's passage across the ocean received land as a reward. Want more land? Bring more people. And the tobacco leaf itself became currency. Actual currency. People paid taxes with it and settled debts with it. A man would come to settle his accounts and lay down tobacco receipts instead of coins. Just imagine, an entire economy resting not on gold, but on dried leaves. Exports grew at a staggering pace. By 1700, the colonies were shipping around 35 million pounds of tobacco a year. By the 1770s, that figure had jumped to nearly 100 million. Money flowed freely. Planters grew wealthy. It looked on the surface like a success story. But this wealth had an extraordinarily dark underside, and it deserves to be spoken about honestly. First, tobacco turned out to be a genuine plunderer of the land. It stripped the soil of its nutrients within just a few seasons, and a field that had recently been generous became a wasteland. Planters therefore constantly needed new land, and they took it from the indigenous peoples, the very ones who had given this plant to the world. A plant they had held sacred was now driving them from their ancestral lands. And second, and this is the hardest part, tobacco demanded enormous grueling labor from many hands. And those hands were increasingly the hands of enslaved people. The shift toward forced labor accelerated sharply after a major uprising in Virginia in 1676. Then in 1705, specific laws were enacted that legally codified lifelong slavery for entire generations of people. The connection between tobacco and the slave trade stretched across the ocean as well. Far away in Brazil, workers made a special twisted tobacco soaked in sweet molasses, and on the shores of West Africa, that same product was traded for enslaved people. Fragrant leaves were exchanged for human lives. That was the true cost behind those impressive export figures. For a long time, roughly 200 years, tobacco remained a luxury for the privileged few. People smoked it in pipes, puffed on expensive cigars, chewed it, and took particular delight in sniffing it. Snuff was the favorite pastime of 18th century European aristocracy, an elegant gesture, a mark of refinement. But what about the cigarette, the one we know today? Its origins couldn't have been humbler. Poor people in the Spanish city of Seville simply wrapped tobacco scraps and crumbs in small pieces of paper. They couldn't afford a proper cigar. Later, soldiers picked up the habit during the Crimean War. But there was one catch. Every cigarette had to be rolled by hand, and that was slow work. So the cigarette stayed on the margins, a trivial thing that nobody took seriously. And then a machine entered the picture, one that changed everything. A tobacco company offered a reward to anyone who could invent a cigarette rolling device. And around 1880, an inventor named James Bonsack patented his machine. Just think about what it could do. It produced roughly 200 cigarettes a minute. A minute. One machine replaced dozens of workers toiling away all day long. The cigarette went from an expensive hand-rolled rarity to a cheap product that could be churned out by the thousands and millions. And the world embraced the new invention with breathtaking speed. In Britain, a Bristol company bought the rights to Bonsack's machine in 1883 and set up production of affordable cigarettes. And in the United States, a man named James Duke, armed with the same technology and an aggressive advertising campaign unlike anything seen before, built his own tobacco empire. His grip was so powerful that when he arrived on the British market, local companies had to scramble to unite just to hold their ground against him. That's how, in 1901, one major British tobacco alliance was born. And a year later, when the two giants on either side of the Atlantic reached a truce, yet another enormous company emerged to trade across the entire world. The American tobacco giant had by that point seized control of nearly its entire domestic market. It grew so powerful that the Supreme Court itself stepped in and broke the behemoth apart in 1911. Its dominance had simply grown too great. But the real explosion that turned the cigarette into a companion for millions came through war, through terrible world wars. In the First World War, cigarettes became part of soldiers' rations, and well-meaning organizations shipped millions of them to the front. It was believed they helped keep men's spirits up in the trenches. In the Second World War, cigarettes were once again packed into soldiers' rations alongside food. In 1942, a famous advertising campaign swept across America, claiming that a beloved brand had changed the color of its packaging for the war effort. And in a devastated, starving post-war Europe, a pack of cigarettes became hard currency. You could trade it for bread, clothing, anything at all. And so, the golden age of tobacco arrived, the post-war years. In the mid-1950s, advertisers invented the image of a rugged, masculine cowboy, and he sold cigarettes to men around the world as a symbol of freedom and strength. Women had been targeted even earlier, with a clever slogan urging them to reach for a cigarette instead of a sweet. And cinema finished the job. The most glamorous actors and actresses smoked on screen, and a curl of smoke in frame seemed the very height of elegance and sophistication. The results were staggering. At the peak, roughly 80% of British men smoked, 8 out of 10, and nearly half of all American adults. Entire nations were wreathed in smoke, genuinely believing there was nothing wrong with it. But it was during those very years of triumph, while smoke drifted across the whole planet, that scientists and quiet laboratories were already beginning to notice something troubling. Something that would very soon blow that beautiful world apart from within. The collision between tobacco and science, the great lie, and the reckoning. That's what the third and final part is about. The first warning signs rang out long before the world was ready to hear them. Back in the 1930s, An Argentine physician named Angel Raffo was conducting experiments and demonstrating that tar from tobacco smoke caused tumors in animals. And in 1939, a German researcher named Franz Müller explicitly identified the link between smoking and lung cancer. But there was a problem. This work had been done too close to the German regime of the time, to that horrific government, and the world simply brushed it aside, unwilling to listen. Years that could have mattered were lost. The real turning point came in the 1950s. Several major studies all pointed to the same conclusion. In 1950, an important scientific paper by two American researchers was published. In Britain in 1951, a landmark study began that tracked the health of thousands of doctors over many years, and another large-scale study covered an enormous number of people. All of them said the same thing: the link between smoking and a deadly disease could no longer be denied. It had been proven. And how did the mighty tobacco industry respond? Did it prove its product was safe? No. It did something far more cunning and far more dishonest. It didn't produce evidence. It produced doubt. In December 1953, the executives of the largest companies held a secret meeting and hired a public relations firm, specialists in shaping public opinion. By January of the following year, their statement to smokers had appeared in hundreds of newspapers across the country. It was reassuring in tone and seemingly caring. They also created a special committee, supposedly for scientific research. Only that committee's purpose had nothing to do with finding the truth. Its purpose was to muddy the waters, to confuse people, to suggest that scientists weren't yet certain about anything, that the question was still open, that there was nothing to fear. And there's one document, an internal memo from one of the companies, dated 1969, that states this with chilling bluntness. It says in black and white, doubt is their product. Doubt was what they were selling to the public. But the truth could no longer be stopped. The government delivered its verdict twice. First, in Britain in 1962, a respected body of physicians published a report called Smoking and Health, and became the first major medical authority to hold tobacco accountable. Then, in 1964, the Surgeon General of the United States released his own report. It was deliberately published on a Saturday when the stock exchange was closed. There were fears of panic among those who had invested in tobacco. The report confirmed it. Smoking causes lung cancer. The country was shaken to its core. But the industry itself, sadly, was not stopped. The first warning labels appeared on cigarette packs. Advertising began to be restricted. Britain banned cigarette advertising on television in 1965, and America removed it from the airwaves in early 1971. But the companies simply changed tactics. If they couldn't shout at everyone, they'd target people precisely. A brand was created specifically for women, with a slogan that flattered them and promised a sense of freedom. Particular varieties were promoted in certain neighborhoods, others elsewhere. And above all, the tobacco giants rushed to conquer new territory, the countries of Asia and Africa. In the 1980s, they even used the trade pressure of an entire nation to pry open the markets of distant countries. And yet the walls were closing in on the deceivers. The 1990s proved fatal for them. In 1994, secret internal documents from one of the companies leaked to the outside world. That same year, congressional hearings were held, and the entire country watched as 7 executives from the largest companies raised their hands, swore to tell the truth, and declared, "Nicotine is not addictive." They said it under oath. They lied under oath, and millions of people watched them do it. And then someone came forward who simply couldn't stay silent any longer. A former industry insider named Jeffrey Wigand confirmed the devastating truth in 1996. The nicotine levels in cigarettes had been deliberately manipulated, not by accident, on purpose. Then entire states began filing lawsuits against the tobacco companies. One relentless attorney general drove those cases forward, and the suits forced the giants to hand over millions of internal documents they'd worked so hard to keep buried. The reckoning had arrived. In November of 1998, a landmark settlement was reached. The largest companies were ordered to pay the states a breathtaking sum, no less than $206 billion. They were also forced to dismantle the very organizations that had spent years spreading lies. And then came the federal case we started this whole story with. Judge Kessler's ruling, and the public admission in which the companies described their own deception in their own words. And the efforts did bear real fruit. The share of smoking adults in America fell from roughly 42% in 1965 to around 11 or 12% today. Among teenagers, smoking dropped to the lowest level ever recorded. It looked like victory. The monster had been defeated. But don't celebrate just yet. The industry didn't give up. It simply reinvented itself. The idea of a device that delivers nicotine without burning tobacco is old. It was patented back in 1963, but it sat unused for decades. Then in 2003, a Chinese pharmacist whose father had died of lung cancer built the first working electronic version. A bitter irony. By the mid-2000s, these devices were flooding the market, and from around 2015, one brand, with sweet, enticing flavors, set off a genuine craze among teenagers. It peaked at roughly 2019, when more than 5 million American schoolchildren were using these devices. A major tobacco company poured around $13 billion into the business. Before long, an outbreak of severe lung injuries swept the country, claiming dozens of lives. When flavors were banned, cheap disposable versions took their place. And all of this came wrapped in appealing talk about some vision of a smoke-free future. The names changed, the devices changed, shiny and new. But the substance, the chemistry inside, stayed exactly the same. And when you step back and look at the whole arc, from ancient sacred pipes to gleaming gadgets in school bathrooms, one thing becomes clear. Tobacco has been one of the most consequential plants in human history. It funded colonies, it fed slavery, it built vast fortunes, it corrupted and bought science, and it kills, by some estimates, more than 8 million people every single year. Around 1,300,000 of those aren't even smokers. They're people who simply breathe someone else's smoke. Tobacco remains the leading cause of preventable death to this day. And perhaps the most painful part, the majority of the world's roughly 1.5 billion smokers now live in poorer countries. But here's what's most troubling of all. After all the reports, after all the trials, after all the billion-dollar settlements and public admissions, the industry has started the very same cycle all over again. First, a new product, then manufactured doubt, then addiction. And now there's only one question left. Will we manage to catch them in time this time around? If you learned something new from this video, please leave a like. It genuinely makes a difference. Subscribe so you don't miss the next story. And let me know in the comments, what surprised you the most? I'd really love to read your answers.